Chapter 14. When they awoke in the odd half-light of the cave, the men were all famished. Ammon renewed his offer of the fruit of life. He plucked one of the odd glowing things off the wall and took a bite to give the example. "It is not pleasant," he warned them. "It tastes something like raw mushroom. A while after you eat it, you will begin to feel a fire in your belly and strength in your limbs." Dumuzi plucked one of the strange fruits and then hesitated. "Are you sure it will be all right for me to eat this?" "It will not harm you," Ammon answered, with more conviction than he had any right to have. He turned to Balashi. "What of you? Will you eat?" Balashi shook his head. "I don't know. I have too many regrets to want to live with them forever." "Your life will not continue on forever, but you will have 2 or 3 times a normal human span to atone for any wrongs you have done," Ammon said. "Come, if any man deserves to partake, it is you. Don't let regret rob you of your future." Balashi shook his head again. "I want to think upon it some more before I make my decision." "Very well," Ammon allowed. He stooped to the pool and scooped up water in his hands and drank. The water had an odd flavor. It tasted of stone and soil, and something else impossible to name. "Will the water extend our lives as well?" Dumuzi asked. "My father always said that it was both the fruit and the water together that did it. I don't know if even he knew what one might do without the other," Ammon answered. Dumuzi stooped and drank a handful of water, then another. "It has an odd taste," he commented. "Before we go, I want to take enough of the fruit to give some to Arya, and Iltani too, I suppose. We'll get the pitcher from the dungeon and fill it with the water from the pool," Ammon decided. "Since nearly 2 decades of devoted service was not enough for me to merit it, would you have offered me this fruit of life if instead I had made tender eyes at you and batted my eyelashes, as these girls have done?" Balashi asked sarcastically. "Almost certainly," Ammon replied playfully. "I don't know if anyone has ever told you this, but you have beautiful eyes. Who can say what effect they might have if you had used them properly?" Balashi snorted. "You see," Ammon said, "that is the price you pay for being too afraid of risk. But enough of that. Dumuzi told me his part of the story yesterday as you slept. Would you like to tell me how you knew where I was and what had happened?" Balashi nodded. "The first I knew of this matter was when Namhu arrived at our apartment in the evening after work. He was frantic and could not make himself understood for some time. He had a horse, and the animal was winded and covered in froth. "Itana has been taken captive at the palace in Eridu," he told me at last. "They're accusing him of being a traitor. He begged me to come as quickly as I might and secure your release. I knew at once that someone must have recognized you as the prince. Namhu also told me that you had asked for the High Priestess to come and identify you as her brother, so I knew that you hoped to escape by convincing those in Eridu that you are Itana of Uruk. I reasoned that this meant that whoever had identified you was unreliable. I judged that the greatest hope for you lay with the High Priestess, so I took myself to the temple as fast as my legs could carry me, leaving Namhu to follow along as best he might. At the temple, I asked for Akala, knowing that without her leave the High Priestess would never be allowed to intervene. Akala came to me to hear the matter. I told her only that some great family in Eridu held you ransom, and that there was no hope for rescue without the intervention of the High Priestess. Akala seemed willing enough. I can only suppose that the prospect of receiving no more expensive presents from you was enough persuasion. She called Iltani, who pronounced herself ready to go at once, but Akala insisted that she must prepare herself properly and arrive in the splendor and glory that befits the High Priestess of Inanna. I spoke briefly to Iltani alone, and made known to her the true nature of your predicament. She was most passionate in her insistence that she would rush to your side and rescue you. As Iltani made ready, a man arrived who I had seen once or twice at the home of my lord. I don't know him, but he has a sly, ill-favored look about him. This man went to where Akala was directing the preparations and spoke a few words in her ear. Akala grew pale, and at once ordered all preparations to cease. When Iltani appeared once more, Akala ordered her to her rooms and told her that she would not be going anywhere. Iltani begged and pleaded and cried and raged and threatened, but Akala would not be moved. Days were wasted as your High Priestess friend plotted and planned. She sent secret messages to me by several different hands, and she had me running this way and that all across Uruk, meeting with important people and trying to wheedle favors out of them, but it was all in vain. When at last I realized that nothing would come of this nonsense, I bade a messenger who came to me to tell the High Priestess that I would take matters into my own hands. Then I came to Eridu as swiftly as I might. I sought out friends here who had once worked at the palace. It took me days to discover that all of the palace staff, including even the lowest kitchen maid, had been dismissed when the false priest took control. I knew that my best chance of saving you lay in bribing a guard who knew the inner workings of the palace, so I spent several days finding out where the guards spent their time off duty, making casual conversation with several of them to learn who was fond of gambling or who had great debts, and finally targeting one whom I could approach. It all took far longer than I liked, but finally I became familiar enough with a heavy gambler and drinker who owed a fortune to his creditors. I softened him up until I was ready to test him. I bribed him to take you a pitcher of beer. The amount he charged me to do this was disgraceful, but the important thing was to establish a pattern and compromise him enough to make the next step easier for him. So I paid his outrageous price, though I made him swear so many fearful oaths to each of the 7 that I felt certain he would do as I asked. "That beer probably saved my life," Ammon broke in. "By then I had gone many days with almost no food or water, and your present revived both my body and my spirit." Balashi nodded. "I'm glad to hear it. I came to believe that despite all of his oaths, he had cheated me, for after I had bribed him, he disappeared from the places he had frequented, and when I tracked him down after much searching, he fled from me. Perhaps he only became careless with the silver I had given him, and excited comment among his comrades that convinced him to be more cautious. Whatever the case, all of my careful work was undone. At last, I could think of no course of action other than to sneak into the palace, slay what guards I came across, rescue you from the pit, and flee as swiftly as we might. In the secret tunnel, I found Dumuzi, as you know," Balashi finished. "It was all arranged by Enki," Dumuzi said fervently. "Happenstance alone could not account for how Balashi and I met at the very place and time that would allow us to rescue you from the dungeon." "So it would seem," Ammon allowed. Turning to Balashi, he added, "What bothers me about your story is this ill-favored man you have seen before, who prevented Iltani from coming to my aid. Why should he bear me any ill will? Could he be an agent of Lipit Enki?" "I cannot say for sure, but I don't think so. I saw him several months ago in Uruk. I don't doubt that he is involved with this cult of Thalate that Tiragan mentioned once to you. It also seems that my lord may be involved with them in some way or another," Balashi said darkly. "But why would anyone of this strange cult care about what happens to me? What am I to them?" Ammon protested. Balashi could only shake his head. "Your priestess told you once that there were dark deeds afoot in the temple. After this, I am less inclined to disbelieve her than I was before." Dumuzi was shaking his head. "I know nothing of these plots you mention, but isn't it just as likely that there is some other reason that has nothing to do with Prince Ammon? Perhaps there was some other urgent matter involving the High Priestess, something far more important to them than ransoming Prince Ammon." "Perhaps," Balashi said noncommittally. Ammon lay down on the hard floor to contemplate this new mystery that Balashi had revealed, but no matter how much he thought about it, he could come to no conclusion about who the strange man might be or why he would want Ammon dead. Perhaps Dumuzi had the right of it, and it was only bad luck that the man had arrived at the temple when he did. He mentally shrugged and decided to think no more about it. He turned his efforts instead to wheedling and cajoling until at last Balashi agreed to partake of the fruit and water of life. The bodyguard hesitated a long time between plucking the fruit and eating it, but in the face of Ammon's continuous insistence, he finally relented and ate. The flight from Eridu to Uruk was so much like the first time Balashi had saved his life that Ammon could only imagine that some of the gods who had watched him flee the first time decided to make him reenact it, so that their friends who had been absent the first time could see exactly how ludicrous it all was. They fled the palace through the secret passageways in the middle of the night, made their way to the outskirts of the city and beyond, and then kept to the wilds, sleeping under bushes during the day and foraging for what fruits and seeds they might find. Ammon was weak and ill, and they made poor time. If Dumuzi had not been along, Ammon would have sworn that he had been plucked out of time and cast back to the night when his parents died. Balashi, Ammon, and Dumuzi stopped not far short of the walls of Uruk and sat beneath a tree to plan what they must do next. I need to go to the temple to know the mind of Arya, and to find out what has happened to Iltani, Ammon told them. Has your experience in Eridu taught you nothing? Balashi demanded. If you go to the temple, you are as likely to be killed as if you remained in the palace in Eridu. We must gather our things and our money and flee Uruk as quickly as we may. Ammon grinned. Did we not have this very same conversation less than a year ago? You urge wisdom and caution, but I feel now more strongly than ever that I must play the part of Urma-Ug and rescue the girls from the danger that surrounds them. Now that she has flaunted Okala's will in order to try and save me, the old hag will be even more determined to see Iltani demeaned as a slave in the temple for the rest of her life. She did what she could to help me in my time of need. Should I abandon her to her fate when I might stretch out my hand and save her? Balashi demurred. The High Priestess was as ineffectual as you will be. She could do nothing to save you, and you will not be able to save her. I cannot leave without her, Ammon said, with a tone of finality. And you forget something even more important. There is another woman, the Lady Love of Urma-Ug. I will not leave without seeing Arya, and doing my utmost to convince her to come with me. Taking both women along would be like a thief tying a cat and a dog in a sack and then trying to sneak into a house without waking the household, Balashi said. Instead of learning from your experiences, I swear that each thing that happens to you makes you even more foolish. What you say may be true, but if so, the gods made me that way, and since the only thing keeping me alive is my ability to make them laugh, I had best make choices worthy of the hero Urma-Ug, or they will tire of me and let me die, Ammon answered. Dumuzi watched this whole argument without saying a word. Now that Ammon had shown his determination, he cleared his throat, and the other two men turned to look at him. It seems to me that we must help Prince Ammon to save these girls so that we may flee Uruk and find a new place to live. I didn't understand much of what you said, and I have never heard of the hero Urma-Ug, but if I can help by going to the temple and talking to these girls or listening to what is said, then I will do what I may. Ammon grinned and clapped Dumuzi on the shoulder. I think that Balashi could learn a lot by listening to you. Balashi snorted, and Dumuzi smiled. Ammon suggested they split up and gather their resources quickly. First, let's get what supplies we can. Namhu will have my share of the silver from the caravan, so I'll go there and collect it. Balashi, you go to our apartment and dig up the silver you've buried. Dumuzi, you go to the Temple of Inanna. There's a guard there named Aluti. Tell him that you're a friend of Etana and that he sent you to ask after Arya and Iltani. Afterwards, follow the north wall of the temple to a small alcove in the wall, and Balashi and I will meet you there. There's no way I'm letting you out of my sight, Balashi said. I'm getting tired of saving your life at risk of my own. It is much more efficient to keep you out of trouble in the first place. Dumuzi can go to the temple, but you and I will first go to our apartment and then to Namhu's warehouse. All right, Ammon agreed. Let's go. Ammon supposed he shouldn't have been surprised, but seeing their apartment completely trashed, with not a pillow left intact nor a dish unsmashed, was a shock to him. This apartment had become more than a home. It was a safe haven, where his enemies had not been able to touch him. To see it in this state was a very intimate violation. I'll get the silver, Balashi said. You keep an eye out. We need to leave here as quickly and unobtrusively as we can. Ammon nodded. A short while later, they were at Namhu's warehouse. Namhu was in his office, and he literally fell off his chair when Ammon and Balashi came in. I had thought I might never see you again, he said, giving Ammon a great bear hug. If it hadn't been for Balashi, you wouldn't have, Ammon told him. I am very grateful for what you did. I owe you my life for your swift and decisive action. You would have done the same for me, Namhu said. Yes, I would, Ammon said. I take my promises to my friends seriously. Ammon spoke to Namhu, but was looking at Balashi. Ammon let Namhu know that, for some reason he couldn't fathom, he had made a powerful enemy, and was no longer safe in Eridu or Uruk. Namhu understood at once. He fetched Ammon's portion of the profits, then added a generous portion more. When Ammon protested, he insisted. I would have lost everything in Eridu without your brilliant business sense. You saved my reputation with my father, and you created something that will bring me great wealth for many years to come. I don't have enough shekels to pay you what your half of the business is worth, but I can give you at least a small portion. Ammon thanked him and shook his hand. I hope our paths cross again someday, Ammon said, with great feeling. I do too, Namhu replied with a smile. Inanna and the Seven guide your path and protect you. Ammon and Balashi hurried back to the temple. Dumuzi was not at the alcove where Ammon had told him to wait, so he and Balashi milled about, waiting for him to show up. Where do you think we should stay tonight? Ammon asked. Somewhere unexpected, Balashi said. Oh, that's helpful, Ammon replied. Why don't you tell me where you would expect us to stay, and then I can tell you what counts as unexpected. Any of our friends would be expected. An inn or tavern is expected, Balashi enumerated. So let's just choose a random house and offer them silver to let us stay there, Ammon said. Too flashy. Word will get around, Balashi countered. So we'll pay with grain. We'll tell them our house burned down or something, Ammon protested. They'll wonder why we don't have any friends or relatives to take us in, Balashi answered. So what option does that leave us? Ammon asked. I'm thinking, Balashi said. What about that first inn we stayed in when we arrived in Uruk? It was so disreputable that no self-respecting spy would even think to check it, Ammon suggested. Someplace like that would be best, Balashi agreed. Dumuzi finally arrived, and the three of them walked toward the south end of the city. Balashi chose a run-down inn and paid for a room. When they were settled, Ammon asked Dumuzi what he had discovered. Your guard friend Eluti was not very trusting. He asked me several questions about you to ensure that I actually knew you. Anyway, he finally decided to talk to me, though I suspect that everything he told me was well known to everyone in the temple, Dumuzi said. He told me first of your friend Iltani, the High Priestess. Apparently, she took it very ill when Akala would not allow her to leave the temple to help you. Some days after your capture, I suppose it must have been about the time that Balashi left, she tried to sneak out of the temple at night and made it as far as the gates of Uruk before she was taken by the temple guard. Now she is confined to her room and may see no one. Your friend Aya is in similar circumstances. What? Ammon asked. Are you sure? That doesn't make any sense. That is what Eluti said, Dumuzi assured him. He said that her father has determined that rather than bringing no good to anyone in the temple, she is to make a political alliance through marriage. She is to marry the king of Eridu when he returns from Akkad. If Dumuzi had smashed a brick between Ammon's eyes, he could not have been more shocked. Balashi looked at him with concern when he didn't respond to Dumuzi's information. How could her marriage cement a political alliance with another city? Balashi asked. Who exactly is her father? Dumuzi shrugged. Eluti didn't say. I guess he would have to be the king himself, wouldn't he? Isn't that how these things work? Ammon was dumbstruck. Could Aya's father be the king of Uruk? Your friend Aya took her father's decision as ill as Iltani, though rather than sneaking out, she raged at her father and scratched his face with her nails. That one is a real lioness, Eluti says. Her father said that she could rot in her room alone until she's married. She is to see no man till the new year. Only the priestesses are allowed to bring her meals, Dumuzi finished. Well, Balashi said with a rueful smile, your girlfriends have each done their utmost to make sure their rescue will require the intervention of a god. This is to be your finest hour, Urma-Ug. If you do this the heroic way, you can fight your way single-handedly through 100 guards or more. We'll put the single-handed combat with 100 guards into the song they'll sing about my exploits, but for real life I would prefer not to get called bronze through my gut, Ammon replied. For that reason, we're going to sneak in. And I suppose you have a brilliant plan for exactly how to do that, Balashi asked. Perhaps you'll find a third pretty young priestess and beguile her with your manly charms? Ammon ignored Balashi's dig. Dumuzi can come and go as he pleases at the temple without exciting any comment. I propose that we have him find out as much as he can just by spending some time looking around. Meanwhile, your job will be to find us a way out of the city after the gates are closed at night, and I will find a way into the temple complex at night. You have already spent many days trying to find a way to sneak into the temple complex. Why should you have any more success now? Balashi asked. For that matter, you have spent quite a lot of time inside the temple complex too. Can you tell us nothing useful from the time you spent there? Or were you so preoccupied with gazing into the limpid depths of Iltani's eyes that you can remember nothing else? I gazed a lot more into the verdant depths of Arya's eyes than Iltani's, Ammon joked. But perhaps you're right. Perhaps I need only think of what I already know. Perhaps you should leave the thinking to me, Balashi suggested. Just tell me and Dumuzi what you know. Well, Ammon considered. There are generally 4 guards in the vestibule, a pair near each wing. In the courtyard, there's another pair near the altar of sacrifice. In the Hall of Women, there is a single guard on the main floor. I saw no guards in the dining hall. As night begins to fall, I have seen at least 2 pairs of guards walking the grounds around the buildings. Balashi nodded, impressed. Perhaps you have 1 or 2 bits of brain, along with all of the rocks in your head, he noted. You always say the nicest things, Ammon replied. Something else I know is that one of the buildings in the compound is a barracks where the temple guards are housed. Altogether, I would guess that there are a total of 50 guards, with perhaps a third of them on duty at any time. So, in the case of an alarm, we could face up to 50 men within a few minutes, Dumuzi observed. Yes, I think that's about right, Ammon agreed. What about hiding places? Balashi wanted to know. The easiest thing would be for Dumuzi to walk into the temple during the day, find a good spot to stay out of sight, and then either open the gate or else throw a rope over the wall for us. That's not a bad idea, Ammon agreed. You have wandered about the courtyard, but what about the other buildings in the complex? Would it seem out of place if a guest of the temple were to approach one of the other buildings? Balashi asked. I think so, Ammon answered. The temple guests are all either concentrated in the vestibule or near the altar. I think it was even a bit out of place for me to go as far as the pool of Inanna. What about someone wearing a priest's robes? If I went in as a guest, found a quiet corner to change, and then walked into one of the buildings in the complex, Dumuzi suggested. I think there are only 3 or 4 priests at most, Ammon said with a frown. I can recall the faces of all 3 that I have seen frequently, though there was another one I saw just once. Anyway, you couldn't pass for any of them. You're too big and strong. There are many more women at the temple than men, several hundred I would guess. If only we could get a girl to walk in among them. She could pass unremarked. Maybe I really should beguile a pretty priestess. Balashi shared a meaningful look with Dumuzi, and then looked at Ammon, sucking his teeth as he thought. What? Ammon asked. Would you say that you and Arya are of a size? Balashi asked. I'm at least an inch taller than her, Ammon protested. No blade has touched your head since we fled the palace, Balashi continued. A good combing and some perfumed hair oil would be a good way to start, Dumuzi added. A bit of charcoal powder around the eyes, perhaps a hint of red clay for the cheeks, Balashi said thoughtfully. The biggest challenge will be the walk. Men and women walk very differently from one another. It's mostly in the way they move their hips and elbows, Dumuzi said helpfully. A few days of practice and he could likely imitate it well enough. My butt will be the biggest problem, Ammon chimed in. It would need to be more pear-shaped. Perhaps some woolen drawers could be padded to give it the right shape. And what do you think I should use for breasts? Apples wrapped in wool? Pomegranates? Balashi looked at him oddly. Perhaps this isn't such a good idea, he said. It's a fantastic idea, Ammon enthused. The fact that you're embracing it so wholeheartedly makes me question my judgment in proposing it, Balashi said sourly. I'll be able to go right into the Hall of Women, and maybe even speak directly with Arya and Iltani, Ammon said. Let's see if we can come up with a better plan than this one. It doesn't seem wise to pin all of our hopes on your ability to impersonate a woman, Balashi proposed. Ammon, Dumuzi, and Balashi looked at one another, Balashi making clicking sounds with his tongue as he thought. I have something, Ammon said. It isn't so much an idea as it is something that may be worth checking into. Well, let's hear your non-idea, said Balashi. Did I ever tell you about the caves I found down by the river? Some kids who were playing there called them the Caves of Enki. Yes, I remember, Balashi replied. Well, do you remember how those caves are supposed to go all the way under Uruk? And do you recall that the pool of Inanna is supposed to be really deep? Ammon continued. You think the pool of Inanna might connect to the caves and then to the river, Balashi concluded. Well, you remember the sea balls I told you about in the pool of Inanna? I saw more of them in the caves. That got me to thinking that maybe the two places are connected, Ammon finished. I don't think it likely, Balashi objected. The city is higher than the river, so the pool should be higher than the caves. If that's so, then why doesn't all the water run out of the pool? On top of that, even if the two are connected, that doesn't mean that a person can go between the two. Maybe only a fish could make the journey. Like I said, my non-idea might just be something worth checking. I could go down to the caves and take an oil lamp and go exploring. Even if the caves don't connect to the pool, they might connect somewhere else in the city. Then we wouldn't have to go through the gates, Ammon said. Here is what we're going to do, Balashi interrupted with finality. I am going to see if there is some way to get out of the city at night. Dumuzi, you stay with Ammon wherever he goes and make sure he stays out of trouble. Go someplace with lots of girls. You want us to stay out of trouble with lots of girls? Dumuzi asked. How about the temple? Ammon broke in. Go someplace with lots of girls walking around. Somewhere other than the temple. Maybe the market, Balashi continued. Make sure Ammon pays attention to how the girls walk, then come back here and make him practice for several hours. When I get home, I want him to be able to make my blood boil with how he swings his hips. For your part, you might think about trying to join the city guard, Ammon suggested to Balashi. I'll bet getting stationed on the wall is one of the worst duties, so they will make the new guy do it. If that's the case, it would be a simple thing to fasten a rope somewhere on the wall and climb down. The wall is 80 feet high, Balashi said incredulously. You think climbing down that with a rope is going to be easy? Relatively easy, Ammon amended. Sitting around the market with nothing to do but look at girls felt strange to Ammon. Don't you think this is just a little bit creepy? He asked Dumuzi. What, sitting here watching girls? Not at all, Dumuzi replied. Men have a long history of sitting around watching girls. I guess, Ammon said. But I feel like some sort of predator stalking helpless prey. I don't like that feeling of being a stalker. So stop thinking about it and start doing what you are here to do, Dumuzi chastened. Take a look at this woman here. Dumuzi pointed with his chin toward a poorly dressed, middle-aged woman. Tell me how she walks. Ammon looked closely at the woman. She just walks like anybody else. She puts one foot in front of the other. You're looking, but you aren't seeing, Dumuzi said. Watch her arms. Women have wider hips than men and narrower shoulders, so if their arms swung straight back like men's do, they would rub on their hips. How's she walking differently from a man to avoid that? The woman passed directly in front of them and continued on her way. Her elbow turns in just a bit when she swings her arm, and that pushes her forearm out to the side just a little, Ammon noted. That's right, Dumuzi said approvingly. Now look for someone younger. Her, over there. Dumuzi pointed again with his chin to a wealthier young woman wearing a linen dress walking next to her mother. She turns her elbows the same way, but not as much. She has narrower hips, so her arm doesn't need to swing as wide, Ammon said. Right again, Dumuzi agreed. Once a woman has become a mother, her hips widen a bit, so the swing of her arm is more pronounced. Now let's look at hips. Hips tend to be distinctive. Ammon found a pretty girl about his own age in a simple woolen tunic, with her arms full of vegetables. It was hard to note exactly what she was doing with her hips, since she had her arms full, so he looked for someone else. Look over there, Dumuzi said, drawing his attention to a voluptuous woman in a long, flowing dress. The woman was probably in her late 20s. She had a distinctive sway to her hips as she walked slowly through the market, looking around. Now pay close attention just about now, Dumuzi said. The distinctive sway in her hips grew more pronounced. Her pace slowed slightly, and the sway grew even more obvious. She's just noticed an attractive man watching her, Dumuzi said in a clinical tone. Women who are conscious of being watched by a man will often react by making their own particular hip motions more pronounced. It draws a man's attention like dung draws flies. How is it that you know so much about how women walk? Ammon wanted to know. I learned a lot about women in my misspent youth, Dumuzi noted, without further elaboration. Let's find a few more for you to watch. When Ammon and Dumuzi got back to the inn, Ammon felt pretty confident that he had the correct motion down in his mind. Not too much hip sway, because deep in the temple complex there wouldn't be any men to impress, and just enough elbow twist, since a young woman wouldn't have childbearing hips yet. Dumuzi asked him to model his chosen walk. He sashayed across the room, but every step felt awkward and forced. He tried several more times, but he felt too self-conscious to concentrate on doing it properly. Let's try something, Dumuzi suggested. He tied a length of cloth around Ammon's waist to bulk up his hips. Walk without rubbing your arm on the cloth, Dumuzi ordered. Ammon gave it a try, and found that there was quite a bit of rubbing. He tried it over and over and over again until he could do the twist properly. Then Dumuzi bulked up his hips even more and made him try it again. After a couple of hours, he felt that he had the arm motion down pretty well, but the hip sway proved much more elusive. After practicing the rest of the day, he felt like he was no closer to mastering it than when he had started. When Balashi arrived home, he had to admit that he had no real success in coming up with a method for getting them out of the city when the gates were shut. Balashi and Dumuzi agreed to trade jobs the next day, and they all went to bed just a little bit disappointed. Balashi proved to be both less observant and less patient with Ammon's failures than Dumuzi. They gave up the observation portion of their day quite early, and after an hour of swaying hips improperly, Ammon was ready to give up that aspect as well. Just when he was ready to throw up his hands in frustration, he had an idea. Sacrificing a woolen cloak, he tore it into strips, and draped the strips from the low rafters of their room. He walked past the strips, and tried to hit one on his right side, then one on his left with his hips. They proved to be too far apart, so he adjusted them and tried again. It turned out that having a target to shoot for made his practice much easier, so that by the time Dumuzi returned, Ammon was fairly confident that he had both the twist and sway down properly. Dumuzi approved of his progress, and suggested that the following day they would test his new skills in the market with Ammon dressed up as a girl. If no one took a second look at him, they would declare his disguise a success. He also reported that he had located a small postern door in the wall on the south side of the city, not far from the gate. The postern was accessed through the guard barracks, so it didn't seem any more likely to be useful to them than the city gate, but if they didn't come up with anything else, he supposed they might find a way to use it. Ammon's test run in the market proved a resounding success. He had dolled himself up with inexpertly applied makeup, a sash around his hips to add width, and a pair of pomegranates wrapped tightly to his chest. After he had walked around the marketplace for more than an hour, he noticed a group of young men looking his way, so he slowed his pace and increased his hip sway. Dumuzi told him that his results had been very convincing. With his physical attributes up to par, Ammon took Dumuzi with him to complete his disguise. They made a brief visit to Puzrish Dagon's warehouse, which he and Namhu visited from time to time. Puzrish Dagon was preparing for a trip to Ur, but he took a brief break from overseeing preparations to speak with Ammon. Namhu speaks very highly of your skill, Etana, Puzrish Dagon noted. He's very congratulatory of you too, Ammon told the older man. After a bit more small talk, Ammon explained to Puzrish Dagon that he wanted to buy a temple dress for his sister. The linen she gets from whoever makes it currently is garbage. It lasts only a couple of washings before the hem starts to fray, Ammon told him. With a bit more judicious flattery, Puzrish Dagon agreed to sell him a pair of dresses, and Ammon went on his way. Balashi was against Ammon making a test run at the temple that evening, but Ammon would not be put off. The New Year festival is only days away, Ammon argued. We still need to find out where Arya and Iltani are being held, and find some way of getting to them without alerting the temple guard. Iltani escaped once. Maybe she knows an easy way out of the temple. Balashi finally acceded, but he forced Ammon to agree that, even if the opportunity presented itself, he would not try to get the girls out of the temple complex. If they flee the temple before we have a way out of the city, we'll be like rats caught in a trap, and it will mean all of our heads, Balashi said. Ammon saw the sense in this, though it riled him. Dumuzi's contribution to the plan was to suggest that Ammon write a tablet addressed to a member of the temple council and carry it around everywhere he went. "You need an urgent errand to excuse unusual behavior," Dumuzi explained. Ammon purchased clay and a reed at the market and addressed the tablet to Akala. He wrote as if he were a spy with an urgent warning regarding perfidy on the part of the king of Eridu. He gave it enough detail to be convincing, but left it vague enough that it shouldn't be easy to immediately prove that it was a fake. All of the preparations were finally complete, just as the sun was starting to streak the sky with orange and red. The three men arrived at the temple complex as the light was starting to fail, the better to prevent anyone from seeing Ammon too clearly. They went to the alcove in the wall and began the most difficult part of their plan. Balashi and Dumuzi each made a step for Ammon with their hands, then tried to synchronize a strong push to get him high enough in the air that he could grab the top of the wall. They failed utterly. Next, they tried bracing themselves against the wall and having Ammon climb up on their shoulders, 1 foot on Balashi and 1 foot on Dumuzi. Ammon leapt and tried to grasp the top of the wall. They tried this 3 times, and once Ammon briefly caught the top of the wall, but he didn't have sufficient leverage and had to drop back down. What finally worked was to create a human ladder with Dumuzi at its base, Balashi on his shoulders, and Ammon on Balashi's shoulder.